think it's probably important for me to start out by telling you I don't believe in heaven or hell or an afterlife or ghosts or spirits. I believe in science and math and the properties of physics. And so the first time I came to understand death, it's not surprising that I understood it in a very basic mathematical principle, which was subtraction. In 1968, we were driving home from my grandparents' house in New York in our favorite mode of transportation, which was a 1961 VW microbus. Now, sometime after Thanksgiving, my father had taken all of the seats out of the back of the bus in an attempt to have the most possible room for the treasures that were going to appear at the town dump put and take during the holiday season. So as we're traveling in the bus, my brother and I, now I don't know how much you understand about the structure of the VW microbus, but it's important for you to know that it has about the same structural integrity of a pale lunchbox, like one of those ones with the round tops. So when the seats are out, there's really not much left. So my brother and I would need to make ways that we could keep ourselves safe. And so my brother's way was that he would lie flat on the floor and he would put his hands out and he would position himself in such a way that he would brace himself between each of the walls. Now at 6, I was too short to do this. So my strategy was that my dad had this red, white, and blue striped motorcycle helmet, like the kind from that Easy Rider movie, remember that? So I would put this helmet on, and then I would adopt more of a kind of fluid motion. So as the van would come around, if I pitched myself right at the right angle, it would lessen the impact when I would hit up against the walls. And so on this particular evening, as we were on our way to our next stop at Christmas, which was our family plot in New York, my dad came around the corner and I eased in and we went up a slight hill, and at that moment the door slid open and I tumbled out into a snowbank right into the spot where my family lies. And so I'm not sure if it was the impending head injury or it was just the natural developmental process at 6. But in that moment, as I stood in the cemetery, that was in the space right between the 7-Eleven and the Carvel, I understood for the first time the formula that death took. The more years that you added to your life, the closer you were to being subtracted. And that death was going to come for every one of us. And it was going to come for my grandmother first, because she was old at that point. She was like 60. And then it would come for my father and my uncle and my brothers and my cousins. And when everyone that I loved was gone, it would come for me. And so I crawled back into the van and I put my helmet back on and I tightened down the strap, and I tightened it so tight that I could feel it pushing up against my chin, and it grabbed onto the back of my dad's chair, and I cried all the way home. The next time I had a chance to revise my formula was about 4 years later, sitting in the hospital with my grandmother, side by side on the bed. And we could hear the voices in the hallway and my grandfather talking with the other doctors. And we could just hear bits and pieces of the conversation, words like bone marrow and life expectancy and childhood leukemia. And my grandmother was holding my hand so tightly that she had to pull my hand up to her face to wipe away the tears in her eyes that were just exploding. And I realized in that moment, my formula is flawed. And that while death comes for everyone, it's not coming for my grandmother first. It's coming for me. My grandmother screamed out into the hallway, "No, no, te lunga vita mia bella pupilla," which meant, "No, no, long life, my beautiful baby doll." I thought at the time that she was screaming at my grandfather, which was a pretty regular occurrence. And I realize now that I think she was actually screaming at death. Because while death hovered in the hallway and in my doorway the whole rest of that year while I went through treatment, it never came for me. And in fact, it didn't come for my grandmother for another 34 years. And at that point, as we sat again side by side on the bed, and I held her hand so tightly that when I had to wipe the tears from my eyes, I pulled her hand up with me. She was 98, and when she died a few days later, I was totally unprepared. I couldn't imagine a life without her. We carried out her final wishes, and I carried her to my family plot. We laid her to rest right between 7-Eleven and the Carvel. 3 weeks later, death came again for my father. We attempted to carry out his final wishes, but as it turns out, St. Philip's of Neri frowns upon using a microbus as a casket. So instead, my boys and I carved out a little boat, and we put his ashes in it, and we put as much lighter fluid as we could into the boat, and we set it on fire, and we sent it out into the Nisqually River, and it caught the outgoing tide, and it floated all the way out into the Long Island Sound and capsized and fell over right before the Coast Guard came to pick it up. I still don't believe in heaven and hell, and I don't believe in an afterlife. And I still think that death is a mathematical principle, but I don't think it's as easy as subtraction. I think it's more like quantum physics. And I think it's that theory in quantum physics of quantum entanglement, which is that when particles come together, they're changed in some way forever. And even after they're separated by large distances of time and space, they still interact as if they're together. Einstein calls this spukhafte Fernwirkung, excuse my German, which means spooky interaction at a distance. So while I still don't believe in an afterlife, I do believe in ghosts. Thank you.